This is it. I'm ready to attack. Go. Siege! Siege! No! Damn it. How often does this happen to you? You're ready to attack, but then somehow your opponent just wipes you out. If you watch a streamer, or if you ask a buddy why you lost, a common response will be, "Oh, you should have scouted." What does that even mean? Scout what? Which base? Where? Okay, so I think to understand what scouting really is, we need to understand what its goals are. We can break down scouting goals into two sections, early and late game. Scouting in the early game primarily revolves around checking if your opponent is going to be aggressive. Is Terran going Banshees? Is Protoss going Oracles? Is Zerg doing a Roach Ravager rush? Scouting late game is about knowing where your opponent's army is and its composition, as well as their harassment forces and their expansions. In the early game, every race has mobile units which can be used to scout their opponent. Workers, Reapers, Zerglings, and Adepts. The goal of these units is to firstly see exactly what our opponent is doing and to try to counter it. And secondly, try to delay our opponent through harass. Just make sure to scout first. Harass isn't worth anything if you die to Dark Templar 2 minutes later. Now that you've scouted, you can play defensively versus what your opponent is doing, or aggressively if you think that they could be weak to the build you're doing. As you tick up, you have access to flying units, which are more easily able to obtain a scout of your opponent's units. Using these units to harass will mean that your opponent will have to reveal his unit composition to you when he defends. If, however, you see no units, it usually means that your opponent is already sending an attack to your base. If your scout fails, you should always follow it up with an additional scout if possible, whether it be another overlord, an observer, or a scan. The most important thing in Starcraft is to know what your opponent is doing. At high levels of gameplay, scouting is often done at specific time periods, usually when you think your opponent is building their advanced structures. You can find these timings by looking at your replays or asking other players. Awesome. So now that we know how to get information, let's look at why it's important. If we be honest for a moment, most of us know how it feels when we have no idea what our opponent is up to. We worry that any second we could have Dark Templars in our base, or a knight is seconds away from completion. Knowing what our opponent is up to removes all of these worries and allows us to remain composed and macro to the best of our ability. Scouting also allows us to make sure that the units that we are building are not going to be directly countered by our opponent's unit choice. It goes without saying that figuring out what our opponent is doing, especially a cheesy build, can literally win us the game. We are able to build the correct defenses at the correct time and move our army into a good position before our opponent attacks. Okay, so we've made it to the late game. This is the point where we switch our scouting focus from our opponent's structures to their army. The scouting units for Zerg and Terran also change to the most common cheap army units, usually Marines and Zerglings. Scouting from this point becomes more of a dance. Both players should be trying to fight for control of the map by sending out single units at a time. The goal of these units is to cheaply scout where your opponent's army is, and to try to set up a good position for your army so that your opponent is forced to make an attack that may not be favourable for them. You can also send scouting units to the possible expansion locations for your opponent. If you spot an expansion and you know where your opponent's army is, you can easily send a small force to take it out or move your army in that direction. Now, I'm going to reiterate. The most important thing in the late game is to know where your opponent's army is at all times if possible. Scouting a push of your opponent allows you to set up in advance in the location they are moving towards. Not scouting usually leads to your opponent having the advantage and oftentimes winning the game. Constant scouting of your opponent's army usually lets you know when they send out a harassment force at advance as well. Sending your own harassment forces often opens up areas for your army to move into, as long as you know where your opponent's army is moving. If you have been scouting, it should be easy to figure out what composition your opponent is going for. If you see that perhaps your opponent is getting too many expensive units and upgrades, you may want to attack in and win straight away. Or alternatively, if you see they are only getting cheap units and no upgrades, you may want to set up a defensive position and prepare for an attack. Scouting is not simply a checkbox we tick once per game. It requires constant management to do well. Scouting is information. Information on your opponent's strategy and position. It allows us to make calculated decisions on what to do next, rather than just attack somewhere and hope for the best. If you slowly incorporate more scouting into your games, you will find more success, I will guarantee it. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, then please consider subscribing. You can also show your support by liking the video and commenting below. Your comments help me to create more content. If you want access to more of my Starcraft content, you can follow me at 2dsparrow. Thanks for watching.